Hello everybody and welcome to the Stoughton Writers Group on TV. I'm Mike Hardman, the founder and CEO and the author of Hardman Memoir. Today I got a most prolific author, I think we've got already, one of the most prolific, Dave Wedge, to talk about Blood and Hate, the untold story of marvelous Marvin Hagler in Battle for Glory. This book, I love this book because I grew up around the area, so I think it's kind of a, I grew up and I knew Marvin, like everybody else knows Marvin too. And I was reading a book the other day, I was going over looking for notes, and I had to go do social media afterwards. And I was thinking, like, what would Marvin been like in the age of social media? I mean, he knew. Well, how many followers would he have?
He'd be huge. He'd be like Jake Paul, one of those guys. I mean, he would, he was the biggest athlete in the world at one point. One thing people forget around Boston, we used to refer to him as the fifth franchise. Right. Celtics, Red Sox, Patriots, Bruins. Marvin, his fights in the late '80s were as big as any Celtics championship or Patriots game or anything. So he would have been a huge star. He had an interesting personality. He wasn't super flashy and flamboyant, but when he did speak to the media, he said some pretty interesting and funny things from time to time. So I think he would have been. I'm glad we didn't have to deal with it. Yeah. But because it would have changed kind of who he was at the. But I think Marvin would have been a massive, massive personality today.
You must know it's tenfold, but everybody I know has a Marvin story. Well, he bought them candy at a liquor store. Yeah. Well, my story is I used to run with him. We used to meet each other. And when I ran from East Bridgewater, he ran from Brockton. We'd meet each other and wave, and he would go by me, when we were doing road running and stuff. But I mean, you must have that tenfold. Everybody tell you Marvin's story.
Oh, yeah. That's been part of the fun thing with this book is every event I do, every signing, every talk, people come up and everyone and it's not just here. It's in New Hampshire because he lived up in Bartlett, New Hampshire for a long time in the White Mountains. Down in Hanover, a lot of people down there were his neighbors. Everyone's got a story about, having some sort of, contact with Marvin. Mine was, I met him before he was the champ. I met him at a golf tournament at Thorny Lee in Brockton, and he signed something for me, and just a
terrible golfer though.
Yeah, everybody, but it's been a lot of fun to hear people's stories, especially the Brockton people, the old school people, and if you read this book as you have, Mike, I talked to a lot of the people that were there at the beginning when Marvin was first coming up, and that was a lot of fun.
It's amazing the people you talk to, and then later on, they became more in the spotlight. Vinny Vecchione was one of them I thought right away, with Peter McNeely. Yeah. All these people, you see them, and they brought back a lot of things. I think your book, you capture Marvin Hagler, but you also capture a special time in Brockton and this whole area, too, with the football team. I mean, thinking you read about Donald Wingfowl, I want to ask you about Ken McAfee, and how big the boxes were then. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere in Brockton and not hear them on the WBET. Yeah. If you didn't go to the game, it was on everywhere.
Yeah, no, that was, again, part of the joy of writing this book. I mean, I call this book kind of my love letter to Brockton, which is where I grew up. And I definitely wanted to capture that era in the 70s and 80s when, before social media, before cable TV, before cell phones. And, high school sports was a big deal back then, and Brockton was at the top, nationally. And you had guys like Ken McAfee and Donald Wingfowl. Ken McAfee went and played at Notre Dame, played for the San Francisco 49ers. Those Brockton High teams are some of the best high school football teams of all time. So it was really interesting to go back in time and kind of dig through those,
That's why I don't think it could ever happen again. As an old guy talking, old sports guy talking, I don't think that ever happens again. I think
not today with the NIL and all the, all the way college sports are, and all these prep schools and elite club teams and all that. Look at AJ Dubanska, the basketball player from Brockton, never played in Brockton. He went to all these elite prep schools, and now he's going to be the #1 draft pick in the NBA. That's how it goes now, and that's why if you look at Brockton High football now. They're competitive, but they can't pull it together, and they can't beat the BC Highs and the CMs anymore because those schools recruit.
But I think that was a special time of it.
It was.
It's like lightning in a bottle.
There was a lot of civic pride. It was Armand Colombo. He was our Bear Bryant.
He was.
He was the guy that, and Peter Colombo did a great job taking the reins from him. But culturally and socially, we've changed so much that these kids that are coming to Brockton now, a lot of the best kids are going to these elite private schools. They're gone now. There's a couple kids that played at University of Miami that were Brockton kids that in the old days they would have. They would have. Recently there's a couple kids, and I can't remember the names, but back then they would have played for Brockton High,
Yeah.
and they would have been monstrous. And that's why when I was there, we had Rudy Harris and Darnell Campbell and Carlton Campbell and my friend Tom Johnson and all these incredible players that all went and played D1 football. Most of those guys would have gone today. They would go to a prep school.
Right. But I don't think you catch from Marvin either. I don't know whether that would have happened again. The story. I don't know whether the story would happen.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, look, Marvin came to Brockton at a time when Brockton was in need of a hero, right? I mean, Rocky Marciano had just died, and that was one of the interesting timelines that I didn't realize until I wrote the book. Was Marvin's family moved to Brockton in 1969, that summer, right around the time when Rocky Marciano died. Goody and Pat Petronelli, Marvin's trainers, were going to open a gym with Rocky Marciano. Rocky passes away, and the Petronelli brothers are just looking at themselves like, oh boy, what do we do now? We've lost our future. In walks Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Now, no one knew he was going to be Marvelous Marvin at the time, but that was how their next journey started. And that's a beautiful way that bridged those two eras of Brockton. And like you said, today it would probably be very different because, the city's different. The makeup of the city is different. Marvin caught the end of Brockton when it was really still that, there's still a lot of pride in Brockton. I love the city. But back then, again, before social media, before cell phones, before cable TV and all this media, Brockton was just a place where blue-collar people worked hard, and they pulled together, and they worked together to achieve goals, and that's what those three did.
I was 9 when Rocky died, and that was devastating to the town. If you go back going back and reading about it too, and as a kid I experienced it differently than you do when you're 60 years old. You know a lot of things, but that did leave a huge void. But I don't think they all Marvin and Rocky get compared together, but they were so different personalities too.
They were very different people, and the Marciano family and the Hagler family, very different types of people. But one thing that they had in common was that they were both just incredibly dedicated to their craft, and they were both incredibly dedicated to their physical fitness. And that is one thing that Marvin did take from Rocky. He was inspired by Rocky, and Goody would talk to him about how, give him tips. Here's what Rocky used to do. Here's how Rocky used to do it. Not the boxing, the working out, the eating, the discipline. If you look at the cover of this book, and you look at Marvin's body, you don't see fighters look that good today with all the technology we have. You talk about Tom Brady and the TB12 and the plyometrics and all that. Marvin was doing that flexibility stuff and the clean eating and all that stuff way back then. That's why he looked the way he did, and that's why he was the best.
He was one big muscle.
He could not have been in better shape, and that was Goody, and I think he took a lot of that inspiration from Rocky.
And Goody and Pat Petronelli, I grew up with them in East Bridgewater. Their characters would never exist now.
Yeah,
that's the thing. Like all these characters, I'm looking at these people and reading your book, and I'm like, that can't happen again.
It almost didn't happen with them because of Don King and Bob Arum, and they were shut out. They were very flamboyant characters, and Pat was the riverboat gambler, and Goody was the militant, sort of trainer guy, and they called themselves the Triangle. It was unbreakable. You take away one leg, it falls down, and they lived by that, and that's what allowed that unit to take on the Don Kings and the Bob Arums and the corruption of the boxing industry in the 70s and 80s. Without that strength of the three of them together and the creativity and the relationships, they wouldn't have been able to make it.
And they always looked like they just came from doing construction.
Yeah.
They were, basically that's what they did.
Yeah.
I mean, that would never happen now either.
Well, I think that's another reason why Marvin was who he was and why it worked with them. They built that trust. Yeah. Marvin came to Brockton, he had nothing. They gave him a job. He started, he was carrying wheelbarrows full of bricks, helped him stay in shape, but it also taught him the value of $1 and taught him the value of hard work. And that carried on throughout his career.
Yeah. But those guys, they just, like you said, they kept fighting. And all the what ifs in this book. You think of if Darnell Wingfall beats him.
Yeah.
In the first fight, Darnell Wingfall could have been Marvin Hagler.
That's right. And a lot of people thought he was. I mean, Darnell Wingfall was a rising star when Marvin fought him those first two times at Brockton High. And you're right. If he had lost one of those fights, things would have been very different. Yeah. He was a big guy too, Darnell.
He's a tragedy in this story.
Very tragic story.
Because what happened to him, because he was a good football player, I mean, he was a mean dude.
It was very sad, and I didn't know a lot about him. I had heard the legends, the street legends, and again, that's what was beautiful about writing this book, is I got to go back and find some of those old sort of street folks and the old gym rats that knew Darnell from the streets, and hear those stories about that fight that happened, that infamous fight when Marvin moved to Brockton. Darnell beat him up over at the East Side Projects. that changed Marvin's life. That made him want to be a fighter. And, then to research what happened to Dornell later in life was pretty sad. He had a lot of problems. He fell in with the gangsters over at Gigi's Lounge, started collecting for the bookies and got into drugs and alcohol and, just not living a good life. And he got in a lot of trouble. He ended up spending a lot of time in jail, and he died a pretty tragic death.
And that whole element is different too. The mob element that those guys, like a lot of people I thought were bookies. You proved that they were bookies.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? The thing, kind of shady kind of character.
Well, there's still, and I did this with my Whitey Bulger book as well. There was some Brockton guys involved in that that knew Gigi. Gigi knew those guys. So, that faction that existed in the 70s and 80s, that underground bookmaking operations, that was real. And it was cash. And that's why guys like Whitey Bulger ran it, and guys like Gigi Sergio ran it, because it was lucrative. There was no internet, again. There was no phones. You wanted to make a bet, you had to find a guy on the street. People like to gamble. So it went on, and, Dornell fell into that. The gym was kind of ground zero for it. Vinny Vecchione and guys like that. Those kind of guys, there's some characters like that around boxing these days, but they don't have the power they once did. The mob doesn't run boxing the way it did in Rocky's era and Marvin's era.
But the society's changed too. Those guys don't exist. I mean, they don't grow up that way. I mean, it's just different.
That's right.
That's why I mean, you can't capture that again.
Yeah.
You can't capture that. You won't see those guys. That's why I think your book is beautiful in that way. Is you captured a time that's not going to go back.
Yeah,
it's not going to be. You don't have the newspapers anymore. You don't have the media. The TV coverage would be different. Everything would be different. When Marvin fought, the town stopped.
Right.
The whole area stopped.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing I really liked when I was writing this book was learning about the early days of Marvin's career, the fights he had. And I don't know if you remember in the book, but he fought a couple times in live bouts at Channel 7.
Yeah, that was crazy.
In Boston.
Those are crazy
Eddie
fights.
Annelman from DWE created sports radio as we know it today, talk radio. Eddie Annelman threw these huge fights at Channel 7 in the studio, and they were, unfortunately, there's no tape of them that exists. No one can find them. But
really?
I wasn't able to find them. I'm told they exist, but no one was able to find them for me. But, that's the era we were in. Again, I interviewed George Krieger, former HBO boxing executive. He created HBO boxing. He told me for this book that were it not for Marvin Hagler, HBO Sports wouldn't exist in the way that it was. He was the first big box office draw for HBO. They were able to sign him, and when he fought, there were marquee events. Like you said, there was no other cable, there was nothing else. He sold out, and he was a huge part of the formation of pay-per-view, Marvin. A lot of people forget that.
Right. The boxing Channel 7 was caught attention because it was bringing back the Friday night fights from Gillette.
That's right.
In the 50s and 60s and all that. And I remember the studio was so small. And their fight, I can remember vividly watching any of them promote this. And Sugar Ray Seals came and he fought Sugar Ray Seals. Another character in the book, too.
Great character. And that was another beautiful thing that I really enjoyed writing this book, was learning about all these other fighters, Boogaloo Watts and Willie the Worm Monroe and, Cyclone Hart and Bad Benny Briscoe and all these Philly fighters. And then, guys like Dornell Wigfall, Sugar Ray Seals. I get to look in, do a little research about Emil Griffith, one of the greatest middleweights of all time. And every one of these guys is a book on their own. They all led these incredible lives, and they all had one common theme, though. They were escaping some sort of bad situation in their life. For Marvin, it was escaping Newark and the riots and the violence and the cycle of poverty and not having a dad. And that's what drove him. He never wanted to be poor again. So that's what drove Marvin to fight. And Rocky had the same sort of drive. He didn't want to work in the shoe shops like his parents. He didn't want to work 70 hours a week for pennies. That's what drove Rocky. And all these fighters, the common thread with all of them is they all had something that drove them.
And they all fight discrimination, too. Rocky fought that when he was starting.
That's right.
And then Marvin, obviously, being black in Brockton, being in Brockton in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's right.
That was the common theme between the two of them.
Yeah, and Rocky fought the stigma of being Italian. He and I write about that in the book. There's a couple chapters about Rocky in the book where, he was constantly being approached to throw fights by the mob. And he was very offended by that because he was a proud Italian. His family wasn't involved in that stuff. He didn't want to disgrace his name. So he pushed back against that, sort of mob stigma. He did fall into it a little bit later in his life, and he did become, he started doing some collecting for some of the bookies and things like that. But, that was something. It's funny, I talked to some old ESPN fight guys, and they said, look, if you were an Italian fighter in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, you couldn't avoid the mob. They were coming for you. And it happened to Vinny Pazienza. It happened to all of them. Boom Boom Mancini. They all had the mafia around them, and that happened to Rocky. It also happened to Marvin, though, too. That was still something that he had to deal with. And I don't know if you caught it in the book, but it also went on in England.
Yeah,
Alan Minter, he had them all. He had the Cray brothers. They were around him, and, which were the Whitey Bulger of London, So that organized crime element is always permeated boxing. Not so much now, but in this era. And I think when people read this book, it's not a boxing book. It's a true, it's got a lot of true crime elements. It's got a lot of history. And ultimately, to me, it's just a beautiful story of Marvin and Goody and Pat and how they went on this incredible journey together.
And just Goody and Pat, just regular guys.
Yeah.
I mean, they were growing up with them. There was no pretense to them at all.
Yeah, no, and they two middle-aged World War II vets, and they were both boxers themselves, and Goody was just a really incredible disciplinarian, and again, he was close friends with Rocky, and I think he drew a lot of inspiration from that. And so when they finally got together and Marvin walked into the gym, I think Goody, because of his relationship with Rocky, was prepared to identify a great fighter. He knew what made a great fighter, and that relationship that Goody built with Marvin was why Marvin became who he was. Marvin would have been great anyway.
You think so?
But I do. I think he would have been a great fighter anyway. But I think that match with him and Pat took him to the next level.
But they also had Tony Petronelli before that.
Tony too. Yeah, Tony was a big part of it. And I interviewed Tony for the book. Tony tells a funny story that's in the book. He says, when Marvin came in, he was carrying my bags. He said it wasn't long before the roles were reversed and I was carrying his. Tony was a great fighter.
He was very big.
He was a great fighter. He had, I think, 50, 60 pro fights, and I think he fought for a title. And I think Marvin learned a lot from Tony as well.
One thing your book does is talk about something I think a lot of people talk about. Marvin was Newark. I always think if you ask Marvin, he was born in Brockton. If you ask, that'd be a common misconception.
Yeah.
And the Newark thing's really shaped him too.
Yeah, and that's another thing that was really eye-opening for me to research and to learn about when I was writing the book was, growing up in Brockton, I always thought, Marvin was born there, but then he moved to Brockton. But Marvin lived in Newark till he was 15 years old. He didn't move to Brockton till he was 15.
He was already a father.
With no father. Yeah. And again, the whole story here really is Marvin escaped some of the worst rioting that's ever happened in American history. In Newark in 1967, 29 people were killed in a weekend. It makes the George Floyd riots that happened look like kindergarten. Exactly. The stuff that happened in Newark, it was martial law. People locked in their house. Marvin's family was locked in their house for 3 days. The kids had to crawl around on the floor because there were snipers outside shooting through the windows. And it was really, third world stuff that was going on. And it was all race-based. It was very violent. As a black family, they were in the middle of it. And it was terrifying. And, Marvin didn't talk about it a lot. His mother talked about it a little bit. But certainly that shaped who Marvin was because the family had to get out of there. And she moved them to Brockton, and that's what happened. Imagine she moved to Brockton to get safe. A lot of people don't say that these days. But it was back then, there was opportunity, and it was a much safer city. And it still is a much safer city than a lot of others. But
she's a character, too, man.
She is.
What a brave woman. She puts her kids on. I can't imagine putting your young kids on a bus and just sending them somewhere just because you know.
Well, she had 6 kids, 5 of her own, and one that she was raising for one of the guys in her life. And she was a true mom. She wasn't perfect, but those kids always had the things they needed. Marvin and the sisters that I talked to, Veronica and Cheryl, that I spoke to for the book, they were very clear. They said, "Look, our childhood was hard. It wasn't. We were poor." But we always had what we needed. My mother always made sure we were safe. And that's the point. She got them out of that unsafe situation where she found a way. She went to Brockton. She, couch surfed with some family until she was able to get an apartment on her own. And she cleaned houses. She did what she had to do.
So back got her degree at GED. And
it
was an amazing story. Amazing story of resilience.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Alan Minter fight before, and that book you covered that. That was the most violent fight I've ever seen in my life. Yeah. Just outside the ring and all that. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I mean that's when I decided how I wanted to tell Marvin's story. I found the picture of him being hit with the bottles after he won the title against Alan Minter in Wembley Arena. And I said, I want to tell the story about that photo. So that's what this book is. It's the story of that famous photo. What happened was, Alan Minter was the great white hope. He was the first white champion in the middleweight division in generations. He was the first British champion in generations, and he was the first white fighter to really matter in decades. So he became a symbol of white power. Frankly, there was white power groups in England that gravitated to him. He said, they were tired of the immigration. They were tired of people of color taking their jobs and the things that we're hearing now from some of the far-right factions. That was what was going on in England at the time of this fight. There was a press conference before the fight, and Alan Minter made a horrible comment speaking to those racist factions that followed him, and he said, "No black man will ever take my title." So when he said that, it set off, obviously, a firestorm. Had we had social media today, imagine the frenzy that would have happened.
Oh,
but Marvin took it to heart, and believe me, he took that into the ring with him that night on September 27th, 1980, when he fought Alan Minter, and he took him apart piece by piece.
Yeah, that was a brutal fight. I mean, you always look at the Hearns fight because of the ferocity of that, how quick it was, or the Sugar Ray Leonard fight, but that was his best fight. In my opinion.
He had a lot of great ones,
Yeah.
but he was unbeatable that night. He was not going to lose that fight because of what I just said. But also, Marvin happened to be at the top of his peak physical condition. And I interviewed Alan Minter's family, including his brother, who was there in the corner that night. And he said, his brother had just won the title from Vito Antuofermo in Las Vegas in the previous fight, and he said his brother was drinking a lot. He didn't train as hard as he had for other fights, and he thinks he took Marvin lightly.
Yeah.
And then he makes that comment. So it was a perfect storm of disaster for Alan Minter, and it ended his career. Alan Minter fought, I think, 4 more times, I think, and he lost 3 of them. He was never the same fighter. He descended into alcoholism. He had horrible problems with alcohol. He did straighten his life out at some point, but he had a rocky go of it for a long time, and he passed away shortly before Marvin.
I just remember in my mind, I can see the bottles being thrown in the ring, and people scurrying.
It's shocking.
It's shocking.
Shocking, and I think another reason I wrote this book is I love history, and I think young kids, especially young kids in Brockton, need to understand what a man like Marvin Hagler went through to get to the place he was. And I think a lot of people, when they see that photo or they see the video, they won't believe that actually happened. It wasn't that long ago. There's people I interviewed that were at the fight. Bob Arum was there. Johnny Merrion, his family was there. And it was racism at its ugliest. And those people pelted Marvin with bottles because they beat their fighter. And it wasn't just because they beat their fighter; they beat their white fighter. And it was about race, and it was terrible.
Because you see that throughout the book, where he did face a lot of that pressure or that too. But it was just crazy. That was a crazy fight. And you just look at that fight, look at that too. The last fight, and you don't write much about the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. Why do you think he walked away?
So I explain a lot of this in the book, where Marvin lost 3 fights in his career. Technically,
controversial fights too.
All 3 of them were bad. All 3 of them were bad decisions. Right? Yeah. He lost 1 fight. I believe he lost a terrible decision of Boogaloo Watts. Yeah. He got beat really bad by Willie the Worm Monroe, and that was the only fight that people who knew Marvin said he actually really lost that fight. He lost bad. Yeah. He got a draw to Vito Antuofermo that he should have won. He won that fight. Should have got the title before he fought Alan Minter. And then he lost the Sugar Ray Leonard decision, which anyone that watches that fight, you can't watch that fight and think it's anything worse than a draw, at worst. My opinion, Marvin probably won it by a round or 2, but I think at the worst he gets a draw and keeps the title. In answer to your question, I think Marvin walked away because he had been soured by those other previously bad decisions, and then when he's on the biggest stage, the biggest fight of his life, he gets robbed. I think he just said, you know what, I've had enough. And I think after it ended, he had enough money. He had been the greatest middleweight of all time, and I think that he went to Italy and he found peace there. He met his second wife, Kay, and I think that he really enjoyed his life there. He didn't have to answer questions about Sugar Ray Leonard over there. He didn't have to say, you coming back, when are you going to fight again? He's Marvin, and he became a movie star, and I think he liked that life of privacy.
I think I'm trying to remember the quote. I think he said something about "That's Vegas, baby" or something like that at the end of it. Because he knew. I
think he was disgusted with the whole machine, and again, it goes back to it took him 50 fights before he even got a title shot. Why was that? It wasn't because he wasn't good enough. It was because he wasn't involved with the right people. He didn't have the right connections. He refused to sign with Don King. He refused to sign with Bob Arum. You know, he wanted to be his own man with Goody and Pat, and it took a toll on him.
Yeah, it's like a lot of, that's the amazing part of the story is the loyalty and dedication. Like you said, it's a history book. It's also a sociological book too.
Yeah.
And a buddy book.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of books of that too.
Yeah.
When he walked away and he went to Italy, it's just like he would come back, but it was like he was gone.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, when you bring, like, he's gone now. I mean, and he died young. I think he died young, relatively young.
I think
but
he was
you know,
66.
66, yeah. But he's 65, 66 is really young.
No, I think it is young.
But
a guy like him, yeah.
But he disappeared. But you bring him back. I think I was afraid that he was going to get lost. Until reading your book, he's one of the people I was afraid that he was going to get lost to history.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the real reason I wrote this book. It's a love letter to my city, of course, but I wanted to write the book with Marvin when he was alive, and I had some talks with some of his folks. He wasn't ready to do it for a number of reasons. He just didn't want to do it. As I got older, and then after he passed away, and I had the time to reflect on it, I said, you know what? This guy's a hero, just like Rocky Marciano. He represents a city that I grew up in, the city that made me who I am. I owe it to the city of Brockton. I owe it to Marvin. I'm in a position that I can write a great story to help preserve his legacy. And his legacy is not losing to Sugar Ray Leonard and disappearing. His legacy is that Alan Minter fight. That's the moment that Marvin Hagler became an icon and a giant, and he should be mentioned in the same breath with you know, the Bill Russells of the world and the Tommy Smith with the fist in the air at the '68 Olympics. He's that big of a civil rights hero. I call him the unlikely civil rights hero. He didn't like to talk about politics. He didn't like to talk about that fight, but he did it with his actions. And I think it's a beautiful story that I think anyone that loves sports or loves, you know, underdogs, or anyone certainly from Brockton that wants to understand why Brockton people are the way we are, this is why.
One of the last stories I did on him, you know, I just vividly remember he was at Massasoit for Bay State Bombardiers basketball game.
I remember them, yeah.
And he was, I was talking about him that day, and the crowd surfed him, and they surfed him all the way across the court. And I remember writing he was Gandhi. You know, and now that he's Gandhi, in a lot of ways, that was, you know, I didn't write for that reason, because it just reminded me of Gandhi being carried by the crowds. But when I look back, he was that way. That he was a setter. He was a difference maker.
He was, you know, he led through his actions. He was a quiet leader. You know, he didn't have to talk. You know, he wasn't Muhammad Ali. It's funny, I talk about this in the book as well. Early in his career, he was kind of pretending to be like that. He would like do little poems and stuff, trying to be flashy like Muhammad Ali, but it wasn't his natural character. So as he got older and he got more mature and he started becoming better at fighting, he used his words less and, you know, showed his character through his actions more than, you know, talking to the press and shooting his mouth off. And, you know, to your point earlier when you asked about social media, I'm glad we didn't see that with Marvin, because I like this Marvin. I like the Marvin that just took care of business.
That's what I was talking. That's what I meant. Like I like that he was approachable. Like he lived in Stoughton for a time at Wilson Court, and people there still remember him.
Yeah.
You know, they were the kids were little. They always said the kids were bald too.
He was a man of the people.
He was a man of the people.
Yeah.
He went around. He walked, you know. Yeah. And the silent figure of him, I told you, running with him, meeting him out by Massasoit, we'd meet, and then he'd go one way, I'd go the other way. But it was always a silhouette. Yeah. That's what I remember, like the silhouette of the black hood running away.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you've written six books, right?
No, eight. Now my ninth.
Ninth, okay.
Yeah.
I was wrong. But how did you go from being a journalist to being an author?
Well, I was at the Boston Herald for 14 years, and I had some opportunities to write a few books earlier in my career. One was about the case in Hopkinton, the guy who murdered his wife and his baby.
We covered that.
And I ended up not doing that book. I had another opportunity to write a book about a case that I covered, and nothing that really grabbed me and said, you know what, I'm going to put a year of my life into this. But then the Boston Marathon bombings happened, and I was in the middle of that. I was sent out in the middle of the night in Watertown. I covered it. I led the coverage for the Herald throughout those 2 weeks or whatever. So after that all settled down, I connected with Casey Sherman, my frequent collaborator, and we decided to team up. And at that time in my career, in my life, I said, you know what, this is a story that I need to tell. So that helped me make that transition. I left the Herald to write that book, and I've been writing books ever since.
Did you experience the freedom of not being restricted? I thought, first I started writing books, it was like 500 words, I'd stop. You know, did you go through that too, where you got to
yeah, I mean, it was certainly a big change in the style of writing. I mean, I went from writing stories from the Herald that were 300 to 400 words to I got to write 12,000 words in 2 weeks. But I'm now embracing the long form. I've gotten better at I think I found my voice with my books now, and the people say that you find your voice. And my style is literary nonfiction. It's very cinematic and very readable. It's quick turn, quick page. I like to read page turners. This book, the best compliment I get from people is I read it in 2 sittings. I want people to read my books fast.
I couldn't put it down.
That's great.
Yeah, just good. I'm impressed.
Every word has to matter. Every page has to matter. I don't want to waste any. I want, like, I'm sure you experienced it when you were reading the book. Like, for example, there's some fights at Roseland. I tell a little bit of history of Roseland, because Frank Sinatra was there. And we live in this rich historical area where there's all these incredible characters that were walking among us every day. I like to share those stories with people. The stories of the shoe shops in Brockton, the some of the history of Brockton, Thomas Edison and all that. That's all interesting stuff, and I think that's what makes this stuff readable. You're reading a book, you want to learn, and you want to feel and experience. So that's what I try to bring to my writing.
What advice would you give to somebody starting out, like a writer? What would you say?
I would say, first of all, pick a topic that you believe in and that matters to you and that you're passionate about. That's first. But number 2, the biggest thing I tell writers is you got to write. You got to find the time. You got to make the time. No one's going to say, hey, it's time for you to write. You have to pick that, and you have to set aside the time and sit down. I don't believe in writer's block. I believe that writer's block is procrastinating.
Exactly.
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
And I get it too, but then I snap out of it and I start writing, and it's miraculous when I set my mind to it, I can write. So I think my best advice to writers is to make the time to write and sit down, find a place you're comfortable, whether it's a coffee shop, a beach, your house, wherever it is, but write.
And you work on the Karen Reed book. We'll see that in July.
Yeah, so I just finished it literally this morning. I submitted it. It was quite a slog. I've been working on that book for a couple of years. It's obviously changed many times, because of the way the case has gone in 2 trials and all that. So, but I'm very proud of it. I think people are going to like it. It's obviously an crazy story, but again, I weave in a lot of the history of all the characters involved, and you get to know a lot of these people, and I think anyone that likes my books and likes true crime will really like this one.
I hope you come back and talk about that book.
I will. It comes out in July, so it should.
August. Get you on the early run.
I'm going to take a little break between now and then and try to relax a little bit, because I've been between this one and finishing the Karen Reed book. It's been a busy year.
And I get tired of reading your Facebook posts where you've been. I get exhausted.
So do I.
I get exhausted by where you're going.
No, but I love doing this stuff. I love sharing my writing. That's why I write. So thank you for doing what you do. This is a great forum for writers.
I appreciate that a lot. I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you up in the Stoughton Writers Group. I know that it's nice when an accomplished writer helps other people starting out too. Yeah. You remember what that was like.
Yeah.
I appreciate that too.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for watching Stoughton Writers Group on TV. We'll see you next time. Have a good day, good evening, and special thanks to the Stoughton crew and my guest Dave Wedge, and we'll be back soon. Take care.